I signed the paper at 3 in the morning, when the world was quiet enough to hear my own pulse. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as if it knew what it was about to do. I remember the sound most of all. The slow scratch of ink against paper. The steady breathing of another man in the room, who was not my son. Outside, the street was empty, dark, indifferent. Inside, I was ending one version of my life to save another. I did not hesitate. That part surprises people when they hear this story. They imagine shaking hands, doubt second thoughts. There were none. By 3 a.m., doubt had already burned itself out. What remained was something colder and more useful. Clarity. I signed because I understood finally that waiting would cost me everything. I signed because my son believed I was too old, too lonely, too slow to notice what he was doing. He believed wrong. When I put the pen down, nothing around me changed. The room stayed the same. The night stayed quiet. But somewhere across town, my son slept comfortably, convinced that his plan was moving forward exactly as he intended. He thought the house was already his. He thought I didn't know. My name is Elias Ward. I was 60 years old then, a widower, a father, and until a few weeks earlier, I believed I had raised a good son. I had lived in that house for most of my adult life, long enough that my body knew its shape even in the dark. I knew which floorboard would creak if I stepped too close to the wall, which window let in cold air in the winter, which cabinet door needed a gentle lift to close properly. My wife and I bought it decades ago, when it was nothing special. A quiet street, decent schools, a place you chose because you planned to stay. After she died, people assumed the house became a burden. Too big, too quiet, too full of memories. They were wrong. The house did not trap me in the past. It anchored me to myself. Every routine I built after her death began there. Morning coffee at the kitchen table she picked out. Evening walks past the same maples we watched grow from saplings. I did not drift. I did not fall apart. I adapted. That mattered later, though I didn't know it yet. For a long time after my wife passed, my life was steady in a way that made some people uncomfortable. I cooked for myself. I managed my own finances. I kept my appointments, paid my bills, remembered my neighbors' names. I was not waiting to be rescued. I was living. But independence has a way of being mistaken for emptiness, especially by people who want something from you. My son Daniel lived out of state then. We spoke regularly. Not every day, but often enough. Sunday afternoons usually. He would tell me about work, about his kids, about the usual frustrations of adult life. I listened. I asked questions. I didn't interfere. I believed that was respect. The call that changed everything didn't come on a Sunday. It came in the middle of the week, in the early evening, when my phone usually stayed quiet. I remember looking at the screen before answering, feeling that small, irrational tightening in my chest that comes when routine breaks. He sounded strained, not panicked, but controlled in a way that suggested he had rehearsed what he was about to say. He talked about money first, about pressure, about things not working out the way he expected. He talked for several minutes before he ever mentioned me. That should have been my first warning. When he did bring me into it, he did so carefully. He talked about concern, about safety, about how big the house was for one person, about how much sense it would make for family to be together for a while. He framed it as a favor to me, even as he explained how much it would help him. I didn't agree immediately. That part is important. I didn't rush. I asked questions. I set conditions. I told myself that temporary help was not the same as surrender. And at the time, that was true. When Daniel and his family arrived with their suitcases, the house changed overnight. Noise returned, movement, laughter in rooms that had been quiet for years. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had misjudged my own reluctance. There is comfort in not eating dinner alone. There is comfort in hearing children argue over cereal in the morning. But comfort can be a distraction. It started small. So small I almost felt foolish noticing it. Daniel began answering questions that weren't directed at him. He started handling things without asking always, with a smile always with an explanation ready. He spoke about schedules and efficiency and planning. He spoke like someone organizing a project, not like a guest in his father's home. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this was what help looked like. The first time I felt real unease was the night he brought out a folder I had never asked to see. He set it on the table like it belonged there, like it had always been part of the plan. He talked about paperwork and the future and avoiding complications later on. He spoke in a tone meant to reassure, but the words moved too quickly, sliding past details that mattered. I told him I would have someone look at it. I watched his face carefully when I said that. There was a flicker there, quick but real. Something that vanished almost as soon as I noticed it. That night, I didn't sleep well. A few days later, I heard a conversation that wasn't meant for me. I won't describe it yet. Not fully, but I will tell you what it did. It stripped away every excuse I had been making for my son. It replaced confusion with certainty. It told me in plain language exactly how I was being seen. Not as a father, not as a man, but as an obstacle with a market value attached to it. That was when I understood that silence could no longer be passive. It had to become deliberate. I did not confront him. I did not argue. I did not accuse. I observed. I listened. I remembered. And quietly, without alerting anyone, I reached out to people who had nothing to gain from my compliance. By the time I sat in that chair at 3 a.m, the decision had already been made many times over. The paper I signed did not start the conflict. It ended the illusion that I was powerless in it. My son believed that age had made me slow. He believed loneliness had made me pliable. He believed the house was already his and that all that remained was paperwork and patience. He was wrong. The morning after that night, I woke before sunrise the way I always did. The house was still. Not empty, just quiet in the honest way it had been for years. I stood in the kitchen with my coffee cooling between my hands and listened to the familiar sounds settling around me. The refrigerator hum. The faint tick of the wall clock. The house breathing the way a lived-in place does. This was the house that taught me who I was. I bought it with my wife when we were younger than our own son was now. We didn't stretch for it. We didn't chase appearances. We chose it because it was solid and within our means, because we planned to grow old there together. The street was nothing special then. A few families, a couple of retirees' lawns trimmed on Saturdays. We signed the papers with the kind of quiet pride that comes from knowing you didn't borrow your way into something you couldn't keep. We raised Daniel in that house, not in comfort exactly, but in consistency. He learned how to ride a bike on that cracked stretch of sidewalk out front. He learned responsibility there too, whether he liked it or not. Homework at the dining table, chores on weekends, consequences that didn't bend just because he complained. We weren't harsh, but we were steady. I believe that mattered. Every major moment of my adult life passed through those rooms. Promotions, layoffs, arguments, reconciliations, illness, recovery. When my wife got sick, the house became quieter, slower. We rearranged furniture to make room for equipment, learned how to measure days by medications and energy levels. When she died, it held me up when everything else felt like it was falling through my hands. People like to say, a house is just wood and nails. That's easy to say when you haven't lived your entire life inside one. For me, it was never about square footage or resale value. It was continuity. It was proof that not everything gets taken from you if you're careful enough and stubborn enough to hold on. After my wife was gone, I didn't retreat. That surprised some people. They expected me to sell, to downsize, to disappear into something smaller and quieter. I stayed. I adjusted my routines and kept moving. Mornings were for coffee and the paper. Afternoons for errands, walking the neighborhood, the library a few days a week. Evenings were calm, predictable. That predictability wasn't loneliness. It was stability. I managed my own finances. I paid attention. I remembered dates and deadlines. I made decisions slowly and deliberately. I didn't rush because there was no reason to. Nothing in my life required urgency anymore, and I valued that. I didn't need help. I needed respect. Daniel knew all of this, or at least he should have. But distance changes how people see you. When your child lives far away, they don't see the ordinary competence of your days. They see snapshots, holidays, short visits. And in those gaps, assumptions grow. Our calls were regular, but light. He told me about work stress, about the kids, about the usual frustrations. I listened. I didn't offer advice unless he asked. I believed adults should be allowed to manage their own lives without commentary. Looking back, I wonder if that restraint was mistaken for disengagement. The first time Daniel asked me about money, it was almost casual. He asked how the neighborhood was doing, whether property values had changed much. I answered without thinking. The numbers didn't mean much to me. I wasn't planning to sell. The house had been paid off years earlier. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few conversations, money kept slipping into places it didn't belong. Comments about cost of living, about how complicated things get as you get older, about how nice it would be to simplify. He never pushed. He didn't need to. He let the ideas sit there planted but unclaimed. When he suggested visiting for a while, I agreed to that and nothing more. A visit. A chance to see the kids. A chance for him to catch his breath. I told myself that hospitality was not the same as surrender. I believed I could tell the difference. When they arrived, the house changed in ways that were both comforting and unsettling. There were backpacks by the door, shoes scattered where they didn't belong, voices filling spaces that had been quiet for years. For a short time, I enjoyed it. I won't pretend otherwise. It felt good to hear laughter in the mornings. It felt good to share meals again. But something else crept in alongside it. Daniel began to speak differently inside the house than he did on the phone. His tone shifted from conversational to managerial. He talked about efficiency, about making things easier, about handling details so I wouldn't have to. None of it was aggressive. That was what made it hard to name. Each change taken alone made sense. He rearranged a few things, suggested small adjustments, asked if I minded him taking care of the mail since he was already at the door when it arrived. I said it was fine. I didn't want to seem territorial. The bedroom change came next. He suggested it gently framed as temporary and practical. The kids needed more space. It would only be for a little while. I agreed before I realized what agreeing meant. I moved into the smaller room without complaint. I told myself it was a gesture, not a concession. That was the first time I felt displaced in my own home. It wasn't dramatic. No argument, no raised voices, just a subtle shift in where I belonged. I noticed that conversation stopped when I entered a room. Not every time, but often enough to register. I noticed that decisions were being made and then presented to me as updates instead of questions. I noticed how Daniel talked about the house when he thought I wasn't listening, not as a home, but as a resource, as something that could be optimized, timed, leveraged. He talked about the neighborhood like an investment brochure, not a place where people live their lives. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I didn't want to believe my own son saw me as something to manage. The night he brought out the folder, that illusion cracked. He set it on the table after dinner casually, as if it had always been there. He talked about planning ahead, about avoiding complications later. He spoke smoothly, confidently. Too confidently. He didn't ask if I wanted to see it. He assumed I would. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The weight of it, the way it was presented, told me enough. I told him I would have someone look at it. The reaction was almost imperceptible, but it was there. A flash of irritation quickly buried under concern. That was when I understood something important. People who are helping you don't rush you. They don't get impatient when you ask for clarity. They don't need you to trust them immediately. That night, lying in the smaller room that no longer felt temporary, I understood that the house had stopped being neutral ground. It wasn't just where we lived anymore. It was the center of a quiet struggle I hadn't agreed to fight. I still believed I had time. That belief nearly cost me everything. The next call from Daniel didn't come on a Sunday either. It came sooner than expected, with more urgency in his voice. And that was when concern finally turned into something sharper, something I could no longer ignore. The call didn't come on a Sunday, and that was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. Sundays were our pattern, predictable, safe. This call came on a Wednesday evening, right as I was rinsing a plate and thinking about nothing in particular. I wiped my hands on a towel and stared at the phone for a second longer than usual before answering. I didn't know why yet, but something about the timing felt wrong. Daniel didn't waste time on small talk. His voice was tight, controlled, as if he were holding something back. He said my name first, slowly, the way people do when they want you to brace yourself. For a brief moment, my mind went where it always does now, to illness, to hospitals, to the quiet efficiency of doctors delivering bad news. I waited for him to say someone was sick. He didn't. Instead, he talked about work, about a division being cut, about how things hadn't gone the way he expected. He talked in broad strokes at first, circling the point instead of landing on it. I listened without interrupting the way I always had. I could hear the strain underneath his words, but also something else. Calculation. He wasn't venting. He was building towards something. When he finally said he was in trouble financially, he said it carefully, like a confession rehearsed in advance. He mentioned pressure bills, the cost of living. He mentioned his wife's work slowing down. He did not mention numbers. That stood out to me. People who are drowning usually tell you exactly how deep the water is. I felt the old instinct rise up anyway, the one that doesn't ask permission or logic before it speaks. The instinct that says your child is in pain and you should help. I asked him what he needed. The pause on the other end of the line was longer than it should have been. He said it wasn't just about money. That phrase landed heavier than anything else he had said. If it wasn't about money, then it was about access, about proximity, about something harder to name. He shifted the conversation then smoothly, as if this had always been the plan. He talked about how expensive things had become where they lived, about how unsustainable it was long term. He talked about me, about the house, about how big it was for one person. He asked what I would do if something happened to me there alone. He framed each question like concern, like love. I told him I wasn't helpless. The words came out sharper than I intended. There was a pause after that, too. Then he softened his voice. Told me he knew that. Told me he respected me. Told me he just wanted to be close. He talked about the kids having space, about family dinners, about how much his mother would have loved the idea of us all being together. That was the moment he crossed a line, though I didn't say it out loud. Using his mother's memory felt like reaching into a locked room and taking something that didn't belong to him. It worked anyway. Not because I agreed with him, but because it unsettled me. It made me doubt my own resistance. I told him we could talk about a visit. Just a visit, nothing permanent. He agreed quickly, too quickly, and moved on as if the matter were settled. When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the dark window, trying to understand why a simple conversation had left me feeling as if I'd been pushed a few inches off balance. They arrived less than 2 weeks later. At first, it felt like a reunion. The kids ran through the house like they always had, their voices filling spaces that had been quiet for too long. My daughter-in-law hugged me a little too tightly and told me how good it was to see me. Daniel moved through the rooms with familiarity that bordered on ownership, but I brushed that thought aside. They were guests. Family. I told myself that mattered. For the first few days, everything stayed on the surface. Meals together, catching up, stories from school, complaints about traffic. I noticed Daniel watching me sometimes, studying how I moved, how I spoke, as if he were taking inventory. I ignored it. Then the questions started. Not direct questions, not at first. Comments instead. About how complicated things get as you get older. About how paperwork can pile up if you're not careful. About how nice it would be to simplify life a little. Each comment floated past, as if it weren't attached to anything. I didn't respond to most of them. One afternoon, Daniel mentioned how much houses in the neighborhood were selling for. He said it casually, like an interesting fact. I nodded uninterested. The number meant nothing to me. The house was not a line on a balance sheet. That evening after dinner, he brought out the folder. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask if I had time. He set it on the table as if it belonged there, as if we had always planned to look at it together. He talked about estate planning, about how messy things can get if you don't prepare, about how he had done some research. The words came easily to him. Too easily. He spoke with the confidence of someone who expected agreement, not discussion. I didn't open the folder. I told him I would have someone look at it. The air in the room changed immediately, not dramatically, subtly. His smile tightened. His voice stayed calm, but something underneath it shifted. He told me that was fine, of course it was. He just thought he was helping. Helping shouldn't feel like pressure. That night, I lay awake in the smaller bedroom I'd moved into, listening to the house settle around me. I thought about the call that brought them here, about the way Daniel had framed his need as concern for me, about how quickly temporary arrangements begin to feel permanent if no one challenges them. A few days later, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. It happened late at night when I went downstairs for a glass of water. Their voices were low, urgent. The tone was not loving or worried. It was practical, strategic. They talked about timing, about next steps, about how long things might take. I stood still in the hallway, my hand on the wall, to steady myself, and listened as my son discussed my life as if it were a problem to be solved. They spoke about me not as a father, not as a man, but as a factor, a variable, something that needed to be managed. When I went back upstairs, my heart was pounding, but my mind was strangely clear. The pieces fit together all at once. The call, the visit, the folder, the questions about value, the casual talk of simplifying. The next morning, Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. He poured coffee. He asked if I slept well. He smiled. Watching him move through the kitchen I had lived in for decades, I understood something painful and necessary. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't desperation. It was a plan. And the moment I recognized that, the way I saw everything changed. Silence stopped being avoidance. It became preparation. The day they truly moved in was the day the house stopped being entirely mine. It wasn't the suitcases that did it, or the boxes stacked by the door, or even the noise. It was the way Daniel walked in ahead of everyone else, keys already in his hand, like he was unlocking something he belonged to. I noticed it felt the irritation rise, then pushed it down. Family adjusts, I told myself. This is what adjustment looks like. At first, the changes were framed as favors. Daniel offered to handle things so I wouldn't have to. He said it lightly with a smile that suggested I'd be relieved. He moved a chair here, rearranged a shelf there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth arguing over. Each small adjustment made sense on its own. That was the problem. He suggested we reorganize the kitchen so it would be easier for everyone. He moved items I had kept in the same place for years, then explained patiently where they were now, as if I'd asked. I nodded and thanked him. I didn't want to seem inflexible. I didn't want to be the old man clinging to habits. The bedroom came next. Daniel didn't demand it. He never had to demand anything. He framed it as a practical solution, said it would only be temporary. Said the kids needed more space, said I wouldn't mind the smaller room since I didn't have as much stuff anyway. He said it kindly, reasonably, with the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome. I remember standing in the doorway of the master bedroom, looking at the familiar layout, the window my wife used to open every morning, the dresser she insisted on keeping even when we bought a newer one. I told myself it was just a room. I told myself it didn't matter. I moved into the guest room that afternoon. That night, lying in the smaller bed, I realized I hadn't volunteered the space. I had been guided out of it. The house filled with voices after that. Constant motion, doors opening and closing, television noise, music from phones, conversations overlapping. On the surface, it was lively. Beneath it, I began to feel invisible. My routines were disrupted without discussion. Breakfast happened earlier, dinner later. Plans were made and then explained to me, not asked about. Daniel started taking on roles I hadn't given him. He collected the mail before I saw it. When I mentioned it, he laughed and said he was just trying to keep things organized. He answered phone calls meant for me if I wasn't nearby. He spoke to service people on my behalf, even when I was standing right there. Each time he offered an explanation. Each time I accepted it. I didn't want conflict. I didn't want to believe that help could slide so easily into control. The first time I felt something sharp instead of uneasy was when I realized he had opened mail addressed to me. It wasn't junk. It was official. When I asked about it, he waved it off, said he thought it was a bill that needed attention. He said it casually, like I was overreacting. I felt embarrassed for noticing. That embarrassed feeling kept me quiet longer than it should have. Daniel began speaking about the house differently. Not directly to me at first. He talked about it in conversations I overheard or in comments he made to his wife. He mentioned what places nearby were selling for. He talked about timing, about markets, about how lucky I was to be sitting on something valuable. I didn't respond. I didn't want to encourage the conversation. But I listened. One afternoon, he made a comment about how I'd handled finances after my wife passed. It wasn't overtly insulting, just a suggestion that things can get confusing as you get older. He said it in front of his wife in a tone that suggested concern. I smiled and said nothing. Inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger, it was the recognition that I was being discussed, not consulted. That evening, I found my friend's number missing from the list taped inside the kitchen drawer where I kept important contacts. I asked Daniel if he'd seen it. He said he thought it was outdated and removed it while cleaning. He said it lightly, like he'd done me a favor. I replaced it later without saying anything. That was when I began to understand that isolation doesn't always look like being locked away. Sometimes it looks like convenience. Sometimes it looks like someone deciding what you no longer need. The house itself seemed to respond to the change. It felt tighter, louder, less forgiving. Spaces I used to move through without thinking now required navigation. The chair I always sat in was often occupied. The table was cluttered. I started spending more time in my smaller room, not because I wanted to, but because it was the only place that still felt undisputed. One night, I walked into the living room and realized the conversation had stopped. Daniel and his wife exchanged a look before his wife smiled and asked if I needed something. I said no and turned back toward the hallway. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was tired. I told myself families talk in private all the time. But patterns don't lie. Daniel began making comments about driving me places, suggesting I didn't need to go out alone anymore. He said it was about safety, about convenience, about not wanting me to strain myself. I hadn't asked for rides. I hadn't mentioned difficulty. I thanked him anyway. The night he brought out the folder again, the house felt different. Heavy. He set it on the table after dinner and spoke as if we were already in agreement. He talked about planning ahead, about protecting everyone, about making things easier down the line. He used phrases like best for everyone and simplifying life. I didn't touch the folder. I told him calmly that I wanted my own legal advice before signing anything. The room went quiet for just a moment too long. His wife shifted in her chair. Daniel's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said, of course, no rush, whatever made me comfortable. Comfort was no longer the point. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle. The footsteps overhead. The muffled voices through walls. The sense that I was no longer at the center of my own life. I thought about how easily I had given ground in the name of peace. How quickly that ground had been claimed. I understood then that the house was no longer neutral territory. It had become leverage, and I was the variable everyone else was quietly working around. I didn't confront anyone, not yet. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand explanations. I did something more important. I paid attention. Because once you recognize the shift from help to control, you stop waiting for permission to protect yourself. And I was done waiting. The folder appeared on the table the way a chess piece does when the other player thinks you've already lost. It was thick, neatly organized, placed just close enough to me that ignoring it would have felt deliberate. Dinner had barely settled. Plates were still warm. Daniel leaned back in his chair like the hard part was over. He didn't ask if I wanted to see it. He said I'd been doing some thinking and slid the folder an inch closer as if it were a gift. His tone was calm, confident, almost rehearsed. This wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. He talked about planning ahead, about avoiding complications, about how messy things can get later if you don't take care of them early. He used the word later the way people use the word inevitable. He spoke quickly, smoothly, stacking logic on top of logic so there was no obvious place to interrupt. I watched his hands as he spoke. They didn't shake. They moved with certainty. That told me more than his words ever could. He explained that these were just basic documents. Nothing drastic, nothing that changed anything right now. Just structure. Just protection. He said my name the way he used to when he wanted me to agree with him, like we were still on the same side of the table. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. The way he talked about it told me everything I needed to know. People who want to help you don't rush you past your own questions. They don't need to reassure you that something doesn't change anything while pushing you to sign it. He mentioned timing. He mentioned market conditions. He mentioned how paperwork can drag on if you don't act while things are clear. That word stood out to me. Clear. It suggested urgency without explaining why. There was a small yellow note on the top page. Just one. It marked a place where a signature would go. I felt something tighten in my chest when I saw it. That note wasn't there for me. It was there to make the process easier for him. I told him I would have my own lawyer look at it. I said it evenly without apology. For a fraction of a second, his expression slipped. It was quick enough that someone less familiar with him might have missed it. I didn't. I'd seen that look when he was younger, right before he tried a different angle. The irritation vanished almost immediately, replaced by concern. Of course, he said. I just thought it might save you some money and hassle. Saving me money had never been his concern before. His wife added something about how complicated these things can get if you wait too long. She spoke gently, like she was explaining something to a child. I nodded and thanked her. Inside, I was already moving away from the table. The folder stayed where it was unopened. Daniel eventually picked it up and slid it back into his bag, as if this were a minor delay, not a refusal. He told me to take my time. He smiled. That smile stayed with me long after everyone went to bed. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling in the smaller room that had never felt temporary. I replayed the conversation in my mind, not the words, but the shape of it. The pressure disguised as patience. The urgency without explanation. The assumption that my agreement was only a matter of time. Sometime after midnight, I heard them talking downstairs. Their voices were low, tense, not meant to carry. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. I already knew the direction things were moving. The next morning, I made a decision I didn't announce. I wasn't going to sign anything. And I wasn't going to tell them that yet. Silence, I was learning, had weight if you used it correctly. Over the next few days, Daniel increased the pressure, but subtly. He mentioned the folder again in passing, as if checking a box. He asked if I had had a chance to look at things. He reminded me that lawyers can be expensive and slow. Each reminder was wrapped in concern. Each one carried the same message beneath it. Hurry up. I noticed other things too. He had added himself to conversations that didn't involve him. He spoke for me when people asked questions. He answered things I hadn't finished saying. It was small, almost polite. That made it worse. One afternoon I realized My bank statement was no longer in the pile of mail I kept by the counter. I asked Daniel if he'd seen it. He said he thought it was something that needed attention and had set it aside. When I asked where, he hesitated before pointing to his bag. I didn't ask to see it. I didn't argue. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. That night, I called a lawyer I had worked with years earlier. I didn't use my phone in the house. I stepped outside and walked down the block, letting the cool air steady me. When he answered, I told him I needed to see him privately. I said it was urgent. He didn't ask questions. He told me when to come. When I brought the folder to his office, he didn't need long. He read quietly, carefully, his expression changing in ways that made my skin prickle. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at me without softening his voice. "If you sign this," he said, "you give up control of your house." I told him Daniel had said it didn't change anything. The lawyer let out a slow breath and shook his head. He explained what the language actually did, how authority shifted, how decisions could be made without me, how easily someone could claim they were acting in my best interest while removing my say entirely. I felt embarrassed then, not because I had trusted my son, but because I had almost doubted my instincts. The lawyer asked me a question he didn't ask lightly. He asked if I felt safe in my own home. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the folder, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way decisions were being made around me. "I don't know," I said. And that was the truth. He told me what I was experiencing had a name. He told me it followed a pattern. It started with help. It moved to management. It ended with control. He told me that age and family made people hesitate longer than they should. When I left his office, I didn't feel panicked. I felt focused. Back at the house, Daniel was cheerful, relaxed. He asked how my day had been. He didn't mention the folder. He didn't need to. He believed time was on his side. That night, I heard another conversation. Clearer this time, more direct. They talked about doctors, about evaluations, about how easy it would be to explain my confusion if paperwork was already in place. They spoke about the house like a solution to their problems, not a place where a man lived. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. I went back upstairs and closed the door gently. My heart was racing, but my mind was calm in a way it hadn't been for weeks. The folder wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't premature planning. It was a test. A way to see how easily I would hand over my authority if it was wrapped in enough concern. They believed I was slowing down, that I was overwhelmed, that I would eventually give in because it would be easier than pushing back. They were wrong about one thing. I was done being polite. From that moment on, every silence was intentional. Every nod was measured. I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was preparing for it. Because once someone shows you the paper they plan to take everything with you, stop pretending the conversation is about the future. It's about survival. I didn't plan to hear what I heard. It wasn't curiosity that pulled me out of bed that night. It was the kind of restlessness that settles in your bones when your instincts won't let you sleep. The house was quiet in the way it gets after midnight, when even familiar sounds feel foreign. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting breaths, waiting for my thoughts to slow. They didn't. Sometime after 2, I got up for water. I didn't turn on the light in the hallway. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of that house, even in the dark. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard voices below me. Low, urgent. Not the easy chatter of people winding down for the night. These voices were sharp, clipped, controlled. Daniel's voice was unmistakable. I stopped where I was, my hand on the banister. For a moment I considered making my presence known, clearing my throat, letting them know I was there. That was habit, courtesy. Something in me said not to. Something older and more reliable told me to listen instead. They were in the kitchen. I could hear the faint scrape of a chair, the soft thud of something being set on the table. Daniel was speaking quietly but firmly, the way he did when he thought he was being reasonable. His wife answered him in a whisper that carried more frustration than affection. "We can't wait forever," she said. "The longer this drags out, the harder it gets." Daniel told her to lower her voice. He sounded irritated, not worried. That mattered. He wasn't afraid of being heard by me. He was afraid of being interrupted. "I know," he said. "I just need him to sign. Once that's done, everything else is manageable." The words settled into me slowly like sediment. Once that's done. Not if. Not maybe. When? His wife laughed quietly, a short sound with no warmth in it. He's dragging his feet because he's confused. That's what happens at his age. I felt my grip tighten on the banister. Not because I wanted to confront them, but because I needed to steady myself. Confused. That was the word they were using for me when they thought I couldn't hear. Daniel didn't correct her. He agreed. He said I was forgetful sometimes. He said I asked the same questions more than once. He said it was only going to get worse, and that we needed to be proactive. The word proactive landed like a verdict. They started talking about doctors. Not about care, not about concern. About evaluations, about finding someone who would be understanding. Someone who wouldn't make things complicated. Someone who would confirm what they were already saying. I realized then that this wasn't a reaction to stress. It was a narrative they had been building piece by piece. His wife talked about assisted living as if she were choosing a restaurant. She mentioned places she'd looked up, prices, availability. She spoke about it efficiently, detached from the reality of what it meant. He wouldn't hate it, she said. He needs structure. People watching him. Daniel hesitated for a second. It was the closest he came to doubt. Then he said, "It's better than him being alone, and once the house is sold, we'll have the flexibility to make sure he's comfortable." There it was. The house. Not as my home, as fuel. They talked about timing next, about the market, about how quickly things could move once paperwork was in place. Daniel said we could list within weeks. His wife mentioned what we could clear after expenses. She said a number out loud casually, like it was just math. That number was more than I'd made in some of my best working years combined. That was the value they had placed on my life, my marriage, my history, reduced to a figure they could divide. I felt something in my chest go cold. Not anger, not heartbreak. Something more precise. Resolution. The conversation shifted to the children. That part hurt more than I expected. Daniel's wife said we'd have to be careful about what we told them. That they might get confused, that we should frame it as something I needed, something kind. Daniel agreed. He said kids adjust. He said they didn't need to know details. He said this was what responsible adults did. Listening to my son talk about teaching his children to lie to make things easier made me feel older than I ever had before. Not weak. Just profoundly tired of pretending this was anything other than what it was. I stood there until the conversation wound down, until chairs scraped back and the kitchen fell quiet again. My heart was beating too fast, but my thoughts were lined up neatly, like tools laid out on a bench. I knew exactly what I had heard. I knew exactly what it meant. I went back upstairs without making a sound. I closed the door to the smaller room and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, until the pounding in my ears eased. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't reach for the phone. I thought about Daniel as a child, about teaching him to tie his shoes, about the night he stayed up late waiting for me to get home because he wanted to show me a drawing he'd made. Those memories felt distant, like photographs of someone else's life. By morning, the house was awake again. The kids ran through the hallway, coffee brewed. Daniel asked if I'd slept well. I told him I had. It wasn't a lie exactly. I had rested. Sleep was something else. He smiled at me over his mug. He looked comfortable, secure, certain. He believed the hardest part was over. He believed my hesitation was weakness, not caution. He believed I would eventually give in, because family pressure is easier to accept than conflict. Watching him move through my kitchen, I understood something important. This wasn't about money alone. It was about control, about deciding when my life stopped being mine. I didn't confront him. Not that day, not the next. I didn't accuse him of anything. I nodded. I listened. I let him continue believing his version of events. That night had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There was no misunderstanding left to clarify. No conversation that could fix what had been revealed. I had heard my son discuss my life as a problem to solve. I had heard him plan my removal with the same tone he used to plan a vacation. I had heard him decide that my consent was optional. Once you hear something like that, you don't unhear it. You don't explain it away. You don't wait for proof. You protect yourself. The next morning, I made a call Daniel never expected me to make. The morning after I heard everything, I woke up before my alarm and lay still listening to the house breathe. Footsteps above me, a door closing, the sound of someone opening the refrigerator. Life continuing as if nothing had changed, in a way that was the most unsettling part. The world hadn't reacted to what I now knew. Only I had. When I finally got up, I moved carefully, deliberately. I watched my own hands as I poured coffee, noticing how steady they were. I felt no panic, no urge to explode or demand answers. What I felt instead was a quiet certainty that surprised me with its calm. The truth had burned away the confusion. What remained was focus. Daniel greeted me like any other morning. He asked if I slept well. He smiled. His wife chatted about plans for the day. The children argued over cereal. I nodded, answered politely, kept my voice even. If anyone noticed this difference in me, they didn't say so. I didn't give them a reason to look closer. That was the moment I decided not to confront them. Confrontation would have been satisfying, but it would have been useless. Accusations invite denial. Denial invites gaslighting. Gaslighting invites escalation. I had heard enough to know that once challenged, they would move faster, not slower. Silence. I understood now, wasn't weakness. It was leverage. I spent the morning doing exactly what they expected of me. I stayed close to the house. I didn't make calls in front of them. I didn't ask questions. I allowed Daniel to continue managing things he'd already taken over. Watching him work so confidently under the assumption of success told me more than any argument ever could. In the early afternoon, I told them I was going for a walk. Daniel offered to drive me. I declined, smiling, saying I needed the exercise. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before agreeing. That hesitation mattered. It told me he was already adjusting to the idea that my independence was something to be phased out, not respected. I didn't walk the usual route. I cut through side streets, letting the distance from the house settle my thoughts. A few blocks away, I stopped and used my phone. I didn't call a friend. I didn't call family. I called someone Daniel didn't know existed in my life anymore. The conversation was brief. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I said I needed discretion. I said I needed advice. I said I believed my autonomy was being threatened. There was a pause on the other end, then a calm response that told me I had been understood. We agreed to meet privately. No messages, no email, no paper trail that could be stumbled upon at home. As I walked back, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, readiness. Over the next few days, I returned to normal on purpose. I answered questions. I followed along. I let Daniel believe his approach was working. He grew more comfortable with each passing day, more casual in his assumptions. He spoke about next steps without explaining them, confident that I would eventually follow. I watched the way he spoke about me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The language of concern had thinned. In its place was efficiency. He talked about timelines, about logistics, about what made sense. It was the language of someone solving a problem, not caring for a person. Patterns began to emerge once I knew how to look for them. The same phrases repeated. The same subtle pressures applied. The same framing of my caution as confusion. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. That realization erased my last lingering doubt. This wasn't stress talking. This was intention. When I met with the person I had called it, confirmed what I already suspected. I didn't go into details about my family. I didn't need to. As I described the behavior, the pressure, the paperwork, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, I watched recognition cross their face. They told me it followed a familiar pattern, that it always began with help, that it moved to management, that it ended with control. They told me age and family ties were the most effective tools people used because they made resistance feel cruel. They told me that waiting too long was the most common mistake. I didn't feel frightened by that. I felt validated. Back at the house, Daniel was more confident than ever. He spoke freely, assuming compliance. He asked if I'd thought more about the paperwork. He mentioned how good it would feel to have things settled. He smiled when he said it, as if peace were just a signature away. I smiled back. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer saw him as a son acting out of desperation. I saw him as a man who had decided my consent was optional. That distinction mattered. It changed how I evaluated every interaction. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the cost of what I was preparing to do. I knew there would be no clean resolution. No moment where everyone apologized and things went back to normal. Protecting myself would mean drawing a line that couldn't be erased. I accepted that. There is a moment in every conflict when you stop hoping it will resolve itself and start planning for what happens if it doesn't. That was the moment I was in. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was practical. I began thinking in terms of structure instead of emotion. What could be changed quietly? What needed to be protected absolutely? What had to be done in a way that left no room for reinterpretation? Daniel didn't know me as well as he thought he did. He remembered the father who avoided conflict, who chose peace over argument, who believed family came before pride. He didn't know the man I had become after loss, taught me what mattered and what didn't. He didn't know the version of me that had survived far worse than betrayal. By the end of that week, I understood exactly how much time I had left before they moved from pressure to action. I understood that when people believe they are close to winning, they become careless. They speak more openly. They rush. And I understood something else too. Silence had already shifted the balance of power. They just hadn't noticed yet. The most dangerous mistake Daniel made was assuming he knew me. He thought he understood my limits because he had stopped paying attention years ago. In his mind, I was a widower, living on routine and habits, someone who needed managing. That belief made him careless. It gave me room to move without being seen. I had spent my life making decisions quietly. Long before I ever became a father, I learned how to read contracts, how to weigh risk, how to keep my mouth shut until the moment mattered. Daniel remembered the parts of me that were convenient. He forgot the rest. He forgot that independence doesn't vanish with age. It sharpens. I didn't advertise my competence. I never had. I managed my finances myself because I enjoyed knowing where every dollar went. I kept relationships outside my family because I believed a man should never let his world shrink to one set of voices. I had built a life that functioned without asking permission, and I had done it so quietly that my own son mistook silence for absence. The person I met with privately didn't see me as confused or fragile. They listened, asked precise questions, and spoke plainly. They told me that what Daniel was attempting wasn't new. It was a pattern that relied on one critical assumption, that I would either panic or freeze once I realized what was happening. They explained that the most effective protection wasn't confrontation. It was structure. Structure removes emotion from the equation. We talked through options that didn't involve accusations or dramatic reveals. Options that didn't depend on Daniel's cooperation or honesty. Options that didn't give him time to adjust or counter. I understood immediately why this approach mattered. The moment Daniel sensed resistance, he would escalate. The key was to move in a direction he wouldn't think to watch. Back at the house, Daniel grew bolder. He spoke more openly about the future, as if it were already agreed upon. He talked about how nice it would be once everything was settled. He used words like easier and simpler, never mentioning what those words required of me. I listened. I nodded. I asked a question now and then, just enough to keep him talking. I let him believe my caution was confusion. Each assumption he made loosened his discipline. Each careless comment confirmed the timeline. He thought paperwork was the finish line. He didn't understand it was the trigger. One evening, I noticed how confidently he spoke about what would happen once things were in place. He didn't say if. He didn't say when. He spoke as if the outcome were guaranteed. That certainty told me exactly how close he believed he was. I began counting backward instead of forward. The protective move we discussed wasn't dramatic. There would be no announcements, no raised voices, no scenes. It was a quiet redirection of authority that left no room for reinterpretation. Once completed, the house would no longer be something anyone could maneuver around me. It would be anchored to my intent, not my availability. That kind of protection requires timing, it requires privacy, and it requires resolve. I thought about the cost, not the legal cost, but the human one. I knew that once this was done, there would be no version of events where Daniel and I returned to something resembling trust. I knew that even if he apologized, even if he cried, the line would remain. I accepted that. Loss teaches you what you can live without. At night, when the house settled and voices faded, I felt the weight of the decision press in on me. Not fear, responsibility. I had spent decades building something that mattered. Allowing it to be dismantled under the guise of concern would have been easier in the short term. It would also have erased me. I chose not to be erased. Daniel continued tightening his grip without realizing it. He offered to schedule appointments. He suggested we get ahead of things. He spoke about doctors and assessments as if they were inevitable steps, not choices. He believed momentum was on his side. He never asked me what I wanted. That was the clearest signal of all. I agreed to small things. I let him think progress was being made. I never committed to anything that mattered. When he pushed for clarity, I gave him reassurance instead. I let him believe the resistance he felt was temporary, not strategic. People reveal their truest intentions when they think the outcome is assured. Daniel began to slip. He complained more openly. He spoke about how long this was taking. He talked about the strain, about needing resolution. I listened and filed each word away. The day we set the timing, I felt no hesitation. Night would be safest. Quiet would be essential. There could be no witnesses, no interruptions, no chance encounters. This was not about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was about ensuring the decision stood untouched. I didn't tell Daniel where I was going that evening. I didn't need to. He believed he had already won. As I prepared, I thought about how often people confuse kindness with compliance. I had been kind my whole life. I had also been capable. The two were not mutually exclusive. I reminded myself that protecting my autonomy wasn't betrayal. It was necessity. Daniel had made his choice when he decided my consent was optional. Everything after that was consequence. When the hour grew late, the house fell into the kind of stillness that feels deliberate. I moved through it carefully, aware of every sound I made. The door closing behind me felt heavier than it should have. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood what it represented. By the time I reached my destination, the world felt distant. Focus narrowed to the task in front of me. There would be no speeches, no explanations, just a single action that would realign everything. I checked the time. The clock edged closer to 3. Daniel would wake up believing the house was his. He wouldn't know that while he slept, the foundation beneath his plan had already shifted. By the time he realized anything had changed, there would be nothing left for him to grab. The day I knew everything would change began like any other. That was the strangest part of it. I woke up at the same time, showered, dressed, moved through the house without drawing attention to myself. The children were already arguing over breakfast. Daniel was relaxed, almost cheerful. There was a lightness to him that hadn't been there before. He believed the tension had broken. He believed time was on his side. I watched him carefully that morning. He spoke with a new confidence, dropping comments that assumed cooperation. Not requests, assumptions. He talked about what we would do once things were settled. He said it the way people talk about plans that are already approved. I nodded and said nothing. Silence, when chosen, is a powerful thing. I played the role he expected me to play. I thanked him for helping around the house. I listened when he explained things I already understood. I asked a few harmless questions to keep him talking. Each answer gave me more confirmation than I needed. He wasn't worried anymore. He was impatient. Impatience is a tell. Throughout the day, I moved slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush anything. I didn't check the time obsessively. I knew when night came, I would act. Until then, my job was to keep everything exactly as it appeared. At lunch, Daniel made a comment about how much easier life would be once paperwork was done. He smiled when he said it, the way someone smiles when they think they've outmaneuvered you. I smiled back. I had learned that people reveal more when they feel safe. Inside, I wasn't counting hours. I was counting consequences. I thought about what this would cost me. Not financially, emotionally. I knew that after tonight there would be no version of events where we went back to pretending everything was fine. There would be no easy reconciliation. Protecting myself meant accepting that my relationship with my son had already changed beyond repair. That understanding didn't come with anger, it came with grief. But grief is not a reason to surrender your life. By late afternoon, the house had settled into its usual rhythm. Daniel was distracted, checking his phone more often than usual. His wife moved around with a sense of anticipation she probably didn't realize she was projecting. They believed momentum was carrying them forward. They didn't see that momentum can run in two directions at once. That evening, Daniel tested me one last time. He asked casually if I'd thought more about the documents. He framed it as concern, but there was an edge beneath it. I told him I was still considering things. I told him I appreciated his patience. The word patience made him exhale like he'd been holding his breath. He didn't press. That told me everything. After dinner, I excused myself earlier than usual. I said I was tired. That wasn't entirely untrue. I was tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. Daniel nodded, satisfied, already mentally moving past me. I closed the door to the smaller bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, I let myself feel the weight of what I was about to do. Not fear, not doubt. Responsibility. This wasn't revenge. It was boundary. It was defense. I reviewed the steps one last time in my head. The timing, the route, the precautions. I had learned long ago that the most important decisions deserve quiet execution, not drama. When the house finally fell asleep, I moved slowly. I listened for breathing through the walls, for footsteps, for any sign that someone might be awake. Everything was still. The kind of stillness that comes from certainty, not caution. I left without turning on a single light. The door closing behind me felt heavier than it ever had before. Not because I was afraid of what I was doing, but because I understood what it meant. Once I stepped out into the night, there would be no going back to the man who still believed he could fix this with conversation. The drive was uneventful. Streetlights passed in steady intervals. The radio stayed off. I didn't need distraction. I needed focus. My thoughts were calm, organized, almost clinical. That calm was earned. It came from knowing I was doing the only thing left to do. As the hours slipped toward 3 time, felt elastic. Too fast and too slow at once. I parked and waited, watching the clock edge closer. This wasn't about superstition or symbolism. It was about privacy, about ensuring no one else could interfere. I thought about Daniel sleeping in my house, convinced the hardest part was behind him. I thought about how certain he was that age had softened me into compliance. I thought about how often people confuse restraint with weakness. They are not the same. When it was time, I stepped inside and took my seat. The room was quiet, professional, deliberately neutral. No family photographs, no emotional triggers. Just a table, a chair, and a paper that carried more weight than it looked like it should. I didn't rush. I read every line carefully, even though I already knew what it said. This was not a moment for assumptions. This was the moment assumptions died. As I waited for the clock to turn, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what I had learned. I had learned that trust without boundaries is just permission. I had learned that silence can be strategic. I had learned that protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you alive. The clock changed. 3 o'clock. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. Just ink meeting paper and a quiet certainty settling into place. At that exact moment, Daniel believed he was winning. He believed the house was already his, that all that remained was time and my compliance. He didn't know that while he slept, the ground beneath his plan had shifted. When I finished, I placed the pen down gently, as if I were closing a door without slamming it. Nothing around me changed. No alarms, no dramatic sound. Just the soft hum of a world that keeps turning, whether you are ready or not. By the time I stood up, the decision was complete, final, irreversible. As I stepped back into the night, I didn't feel triumph. I felt resolve. The kind that comes from choosing yourself when no one else will. By sunrise, Daniel's plan would already be obsolete. He just wouldn't know it yet. 3 o'clock in the morning arrived without ceremony. No bells, no sense of drama, just a quiet click of time moving forward, indifferent to what it was about to witness. I sat at the table, the document laid out in front of me, and felt the strange calm that comes when a decision has already been made 100 times in your head. The room was intentionally plain. No family photos, no reminders of who I was supposed to be. Just paper, a pen, and the understanding that this moment was not about emotion. It was about permanence. I read every line again, even though I already knew it by heart. I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was confirming finality. The language was precise, unambiguous, designed to leave no room for interpretation. That mattered more than anything. I had learned what happens when you allow others to interpret your life for you. When I signed, my hand didn't shake. I didn't pause. I didn't feel the urge to second-guess myself. Ink met paper, and with it the quiet reordering of power. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was protection stripped of sentiment and executed with care. I set the pen down gently, as if noise itself might complicate what had just been done. For a moment I sat there, letting the stillness settle. Nothing dramatic happened. No surge of relief, no rush of triumph. Just the certainty that something irreversible had taken place. At that same moment, Daniel slept comfortably in my house. That irony wasn't lost on me. He believed the difficult part was over. He believed my hesitation had been a weakness he could outlast. He believed the house was already his in everything but name. Belief can be a dangerous thing when it replaces awareness. I left quietly, retracing my steps through the night. The drive home felt shorter than it had earlier, as if the world itself had shrunk now that the decision was complete. Streetlights passed in steady rhythm. I kept the radio off. There was nothing left to distract myself from. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Dark. Still. Unaware of the shift that had just occurred, I let myself in carefully, listening for movement. Nothing stirred. Everyone slept confident in a future they thought they controlled. I went to bed without ceremony. Sleep came easily, not because I was exhausted, but because there was nothing left to wrestle with. I had chosen. Morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The house woke up in stages the way it always did. Footsteps, voices, the clatter of dishes. Daniel greeted me with a smile that carried a new ease. He looked rested, satisfied. He believed momentum was finally on his side. At breakfast, he spoke with casual authority. He made comments that assumed agreement. He talked about plans that included me without consulting me. He referenced the house in ways that implied ownership. I listened, nodded, and said nothing. Silence, I had learned, is most powerful after action. As the day unfolded, Daniel grew more comfortable. He joked more. He spoke freely. He talked about how nice it would be to have things settled soon. Each word confirmed that he truly believed the outcome was inevitable. He didn't know that inevitability had already passed him by. I went about my day as usual. I ran errands. I took a walk. I nodded politely when Daniel offered to drive me somewhere. I declined just as politely. I noticed his irritation flash and fade. He still believed it was temporary. Inside, I felt something close to stillness. Not happiness, not relief, just balance. The anxiety that had been building for weeks was gone, replaced by a grounded certainty that I was no longer vulnerable in the way they believed. That afternoon, Daniel mentioned paperwork again, not directly. He referenced how good it would feel once everything was finalized. He said it lightly, confident that time would do the rest. I thanked him for his concern. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how strange it was that the most decisive moment of my life had passed without anyone noticing. No arguments, no ultimatums, just a pen and a quiet understanding of what mattered. I also thought about what came next. Protection is only half the process. Truth still has a way of demanding daylight. I knew that Daniel's confidence would soon collide with reality. I also knew that when it did, it wouldn't be gentle. I wasn't eager for that moment. I didn't crave confrontation, but I understood its necessity. People who believe they are entitled to your life don't relinquish that belief quietly. The next morning, Daniel spoke as if the house belonged to him already. He talked about maintenance, about future changes, about what we should do next. He spoke over me once, then twice. He didn't notice when I stopped responding. I watched him carefully. Not with anger, but with a kind of detached curiosity. This was what certainty looked like when it was built on false assumptions. I prepared myself for what was coming. Not with rehearsed speeches or dramatic gestures, but with boundaries. Clear, unmovable. I reminded myself that explaining too much only invites debate. I had no interest in debate. The truth would come when I decided it would. By the end of that day, Daniel was restless. His patience was thinning. He sensed that something wasn't aligning the way it should have. He didn't know it only that his certainty was being tested. That was enough. I knew the moment of revelation was approaching. I also knew it wouldn't come with apologies or understanding. It would come with disbelief, anger, and fear. I was prepared for that. I had already crossed the point of no return. That night, as I turned off the light, I felt no regret, only resolve. I had protected what mattered. I had chosen myself when no one else would. When Daniel finally learned the truth, it wouldn't come as a discussion. It would come as reality, unyielding and absolute. And for the first time since this began, I slept without wondering what I would lose. I chose the moment carefully, not because I wanted drama, but because timing matters when truth is involved. People listen differently when they believe they are safe. Daniel believed he was safe. That was the mistake. It was late afternoon when I asked him to sit down with me. The house was quiet for once. The children were out. His wife was upstairs on a call. Daniel came into the living room with the relaxed posture of a man who thought the conversation would be brief and inconsequential. He sat across from me, leaning back slightly, arms loose at his sides. "What's up, Dad?" he asked, smiling. I didn't return the smile. I didn't frown either. I spoke calmly, evenly, the way I had learned to speak when emotions threatened to derail clarity. I told him I wanted to talk about plans, about the future. I watched his face carefully as I said it. His shoulders eased. He nodded as if we were finally aligning. "Yeah," he said. "I've been meaning to follow up with you about that." I asked him a simple question. I asked what he planned to do once everything was settled. I didn't define settled. I let him do that himself. He didn't hesitate. That told me everything. He talked about selling the house as if it were a foregone conclusion. He spoke about timing the market, about putting me somewhere comfortable, about freeing everyone from uncertainty. He spoke quickly, confidently, like a man explaining a plan he had rehearsed many times. He didn't ask what I wanted. He didn't ask if I agreed. He assumed consent. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I asked another question, just one. I asked how he planned to do all of that without my approval. That was the first time his smile faltered. He laughed lightly as if I were joking. He said, of course, he would have my approval. He said we were family. He said everything he'd done was for my benefit. I reached into the folder I had brought with me and took out a single document. I placed it on the table between us. I didn't slide it toward him. I didn't point to it. I let it sit there quiet and unassuming. His eyes dropped to it. He frowned. What's that? I told him it was paperwork. Not the kind he had shown me. Not the kind he expected. I told him it was already signed. I told him it was done. Confusion flickered across his face, followed quickly by irritation. He asked why I would sign anything without talking to him. His voice sharpened just enough to reveal what he thought was his authority. That was when I explained calmly exactly what the document did. I explained that the house was no longer vulnerable. That no one could transfer it, sell it, or leverage it without my explicit consent. That there were safeguards in place he could not bypass, no matter how patient or clever he believed himself to be. I watched his confidence collapse in real time. He leaned forward, scanning the page, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. His breathing quickened. He said my name again, but this time it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw. That doesn't make sense, he said. You can't just... I can, I said. And I did. The room felt smaller then, not because anything had changed physically, but because the space Daniel thought he controlled had vanished. He tried to argue. He said I had misunderstood his intentions. He said I was overreacting. He said I had let someone else manipulate me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I told him that intentions don't erase actions. I told him that planning my removal from my own home without my consent wasn't care. It was control. His face flushed. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room like a trapped animal. He accused me of betrayal, of paranoia, of destroying the family. The words came fast and sharp, each one meant to wound. I let them pass through me. When he finally stopped, I told him what would happen next. I told him that he and his family would need to find another place to live. I told him this was not a negotiation. I told him that I would not be signing anything else now or ever. He stared at me as if he were seeing a stranger. You're choosing a house over your son, he said. I shook my head slowly. I'm choosing myself, I said. You're the one who made it a choice. That was when the anger gave way to something else. Fear. He realized finally that he had miscalculated. That age had not dulled me. That loneliness had not made me pliable. That the quiet compliance he thought he saw had been observation, not surrender. He sat back down, suddenly smaller, his voice breaking as he apologized. He said he hadn't meant it to go this far. He said he was under pressure. He said he was desperate. I listened. I believed he felt something in that moment. But I also knew feeling regret and accepting responsibility are not the same thing. I told him the truth as plainly as I could. I told him he had lost my trust not when he struggled, but when he decided I didn't deserve a say in my own life. I told him that what he had broken could not be repaired with apologies alone. He didn't argue after that. He couldn't. The reality had settled in heavy and immovable. When he left the room, the house felt hollow. Not empty. Hollow. The sound of his footsteps faded, and with them, the last illusion I had been holding on to. I sat there for a long time after he was gone. I didn't feel victorious. I felt older in a way that had nothing to do with years. I had drawn a line I never wanted to draw, but I knew I would draw it again if I had to. That night, the house was quiet in a different way. Not peaceful, honest. I understood then that keeping the house had been the easy part. Living with what it cost would take longer. But some costs are the price of dignity, and dignity once surrendered is rarely returned. By the time I turned out the lights, I knew the confrontation was over. The consequences, however, were just beginning. The house felt different after they left. Not quieter in the way it had been after my wife died, but quieter in a sharper, more deliberate sense. The air no longer carried anticipation or tension. It simply existed, steady and neutral, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I woke up the morning after Daniel moved out and stood in the kitchen longer than usual. My hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Sunlight came through the window at the same angle it always had. Catching the edge of the counter, my wife once insisted we refinish, even though I said the old one was fine. I remembered that argument. I remembered losing it. I smiled at that. Routine returned quickly. That surprised me. I went back to walking the neighborhood in the early mornings, nodding at the same people passing the same houses. Some of them knew something had happened. They always do. Small towns sense shifts the way animals sense weather. No one asked. I appreciated that more than they knew. What didn't return was the noise. No doors slamming. No overlapping conversations. No subtle pressure dressed up as concern. The silence wasn't empty. It was clean. I thought I would feel relief more intensely. I did feel it, but it was quieter than I expected, layered with something heavier. Loss doesn't disappear just because you were right. Protecting yourself doesn't erase what you hoped could have been. It simply makes the truth unavoidable. I sat in the living room one afternoon and looked around with new eyes. The furniture hadn't moved, but my relationship to it had. This room was no longer something I was about to lose. It was something I had actively chosen to keep. There is a difference between possession and ownership. One is passive, the other is earned. I thought about Daniel often in those first weeks. Not with anger, but with a kind of distant sadness. I replayed moments from his childhood, trying to pinpoint when care had turned into entitlement, when concern had learned to wear the mask of control. I never found a single moment. It was a slow shift one neither of us noticed until it was too late. People like to believe greed arrives loudly. It doesn't. It arrives politely. It asks reasonable questions. It frames itself as efficiency. It tells you it's doing you a favor. And if you're lonely or tired or grieving, it can sound a lot like love. That was the lesson that stayed with me the longest. Age teaches you many things if you let it. It teaches you that independence isn't something you lose all at once. It's something you give away in small pieces if you're not paying attention. It teaches you that dignity doesn't come from being needed, but from being respected. And it teaches you that saying no, even late in life, is still saying yes to yourself. I stopped apologizing for my choices. That was new for me. I had spent most of my life softening my boundaries so other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I had confused kindness with compliance. That confusion almost cost me everything. The house became something else in my mind. Not a bargaining chip, not an inheritance waiting to be claimed. It became what it had always been meant to be. A place where I could exist without explanation. I made changes slowly, not renovations, just adjustments. I moved my chair closer to the window. I cleared out a closet I had been avoiding for years. I donated things I no longer needed. Each small decision felt grounding, like reclaiming territory inch by inch. Friends checked in. A few asked careful questions. I answered honestly without oversharing. I didn't need to justify myself anymore. Anyone who truly understood didn't require details. Daniel wrote once. The letter was long and carefully worded. He said he was under pressure. He said he lost sight of things. He said he hoped someday we could talk. I read it twice and set it aside. Not in anger, not in forgiveness. Just in recognition that some conversations can't be rushed. Time doesn't heal everything, but it does clarify what you're willing to live with. I know there are people listening to this who feel that tightening in their chest when family starts asking questions that don't feel right. Questions about money, about property, about what happens later. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Feeling uneasy doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you aware. You don't owe anyone access to your life just because you share blood. Love that requires surrender isn't love. Care that ignores your consent isn't care. And planning your future without your voice isn't protection. It's erasure. I'm not proud that it came to this. I'm proud that I didn't look away when it did. I protected my independence. I protected my dignity. And I did it quietly, without cruelty, without spectacle. Some people will call that cold. I call it necessary. Every morning now, I sit on the porch with my coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. I listen to birds arguing in the trees, to cars starting in driveways, to life moving forward. The house stands behind me solid and unchanged. It's mine, not because I defended it loudly, but because I defended it at all. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a conversation you've been avoiding, or a boundary you know you need to set, I'd like to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. You never know who might read them and realize they're not alone. And if you want to keep hearing stories about standing up for yourself, about quiet strength, about choosing dignity even when it costs something, stay with this channel. Subscribe, come back, and let's keep these conversations going. Because some of the most important battles aren't fought with raised voices. They're fought with clarity, courage, and the willingness to choose yourself when it matters most.